Hi, my name's Paul Weimer. I'm the chair of the USI Performing Arts here at USI. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to a discussion about domestic violence and its relationship to our culture and to theater, and in particular our show that's running right now called Exit Pursued by a Bear by the playwright Laura Gunnarsson. Joining us is Dr. Taylor Petty. She is an assistant professor of criminal justice in the Criminal Justice Department at USI. She earned her doctorate in psychology and her master's of legal studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her research explores racial biases in the juvenile justice system, focusing on how characteristics of the decision maker interact with case factors to impact legal decisions. Dr. Petty specializes in criminal courts and law, specifically in juvenile and family court settings. She teaches statistics, criminological theory, criminal law, criminal procedure, and criminal courts and law. Also with us is Brandon Bagwell, who's an assistant professor of theater and resident lighting designer at USI. He is a graduate of the University of Evansville and Boston University, where he completed his MFA in lighting design. Brandon came to USI this fall after having taught at Kennesaw State University in Georgia and Middle Tennessee State University. Brandon is passionate about issues of diversity, equality, inclusion, and justice in academia and the professional theater, and hopes to help USI and USI Theater grow in accordance with these principles. And without any more to do, here are our two speakers. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Dr. Petty, for being here as well. I know when I kind of reached out to you about having this important conversation, we had some time that we kind of personally met up and just once again talked again about not only the importance of it, but just a little bit of the kind of the intersection of a bit of arts, advocacy, how these things kind of come together in the space, and specifically, much like Paul brought up, with our production of Exit Pursued by a Bear. And I guess, but maybe before we dive into some of the conversation with our audience, as well as just kind of looking about the play as well, maybe I wanted to let you once again say anything else about yourself that Paul might not have already covered, but also just kind of your intersection with this very, I'll say delicate, but once again important topic of domestic violence.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, that was a great introduction. Thank you. I will say one of my new facets of my research I've been looking at is specifically victims of violence, currently specializing in sex trafficking victims, but I'm just trying to get a better understanding of what we think about these people and how that can influence their outcomes in the cases that they have in the legal system and with community providers and resources. I guess to talk a little bit about domestic violence, the reason I'm kind of more involved in these conversations is because I am teaching a class, Violence Against Women. So it's my first semester teaching it, and I've incorporated aspects of service learning into that class. So I want my students to work on a project that deals with violence against women issues, and part of that was that we hosted a panel, it was titled Speak Now, and so with that we got a lot of information out into the community, and I think that's why these types of events are so important, so that people know that there are resources available for them if they're struggling through these issues, if they need any type of assistance like that. And so I was really happy to participate in this discussion because, again, that awareness is so critical, it's so important. A lot of people just aren't even aware of the resources that are available in the community, that there are national resources available, and if you don't know it's there, you're not going to try to access it or get help from it. So yeah, thank you for having me here today, and I'm really happy to participate in this discussion.
And we will, in a moment here, I'll pull up another slide that has resources that are not only here in our USI community, but also within the greater Evansville community. That way, if you or anyone you might know or be in contact with are struggling with any form of domestic violence, once again, I think we talked in some of our conversations about how it is a spectrum as well, and all of it is obviously very important. There are different resources, maybe different types of intervention that each of these levels within that spectrum can involve, and so we'll share some of those resources here. But one thing that you've already kind of said that I thought I found interesting, and I'll say a little interesting in a negative way, as I was kind of preparing for some of this conversation, just looking up, once again, bystander intervention, just discussions, studies on domestic violence, there is a lot of, I will say, negative focus on the victim, you know, and that, or so much work that the victim themselves has to do as opposed to the resources being so readily available. Is that something that you've also found? Is that something that like you found within the class as well, like kind of the victimology? Or
Yeah, I'm great. My students are amazing, and they're all very passionate about the topic. So we don't really have to combat any of those stereotypes.
Sure.
Right, or like generalizations that people have about victims in these situations. I think one of the most common ones is, why are they there, right? Why aren't they leaving that relationship? And a lot of what my class is focused on is making sure that people are aware of how complex these situations are. They're very multifaceted. There can be children involved. There are pets involved. I mean, all of these things that you just don't really think about in a situation. And it's very easy from like a third-party observer of a situation to be like, I would never stay. I would have left right away. It's just more complicated than that. And so I think kind of shedding light on what those people you know, go through, what their experience is actually like, and how we can actually help them is one of the most important things. Because, you know, sometimes formal arrest isn't the best thing for that person, which is kind of, it seems backwards, right? But criminalization is maybe not our best avenue for some of these cases. So it's just really important, I think, listening to the victims, making sure that they're very informed. You know, if arrest does occur, this is what will happen next, right? And that they just have all of the information so that they can make the best decisions. It's a delicate balance, right, of not wanting to put too much of the focus on them because they are struggling and they need assistance, but also making sure that they feel like their voice is being heard and that, you know, the system's not taking advantage of them or the system's not re-traumatizing them, which unfortunately can't happen.
Well, and that's so many of the, whether with the bystander interventions or just the specific conversations about domestic violence that I kind of looked up and was researching as well, so many of it had, you know, call to police. Mm-hmm. And like you just brought up, humans are multifaceted. Mm-hmm. And that one of those facets of that is the relationship with law enforcement and how, absolutely, when it comes to global majority or different, once again, intersections of life, sexuality, gender, sometimes that intervention is not the right step, or maybe it's not the right step at that moment. Once again, I thought you brought up a really beautiful thing about the clarity of almost the full process of it as well, that it's not just, you know, hearing that information and instantly acting. I think part of sometimes I won't say it, an appropriate form of intervention is also sometimes the rejection of the urgency. Of course, this is a very urgent matter, something we want to help, whether that be a very close one or a close loved one, a friend, but it's also a kind of treating that information as precious, especially when it has been shared with you, and not just to, you know, once again, this is a conversation that's kind of tying into our production of Exit, and so without giving away too many things to the audience who may or may not have seen the show already, one of the characters, the play has a lot of moments of meta-theatricality where we are, much like what we're doing on stage with the show itself, the characters in the show are trying to have these cathartic moments with one another by having them present these truths, say these words. One of those meta-theatrical moments, or one of their little scenes that they kind of do, is one of the characters is kind of taking on the role of Nan, who is the wife who is experiencing this domestic violence. And there's some specific lines that she shares with her friend, which seems to be, from what we can tell within the script, kind of the first time that she may be voicing these things out loud. And just to, once again, kind of pull from Lauren Gunderson's the text right here, the character says, "I hate that I have no choice or hope in life because of him, and I stay with him when I should get out. Why don't I get out? Because I can't. I think I can't. But why? Because I'm scared, and all my stuff is there. Why am I scared of my stuff?" And it continues on to their friend kind of coming into how many times does this actually happen? And she says, she kind of responds with that, "Is there a quota? You know, God, it's even hard to say, and I'm saying it and you don't care." You know, I think that's one of the the toughest hurdles when we get into these type of conversations is that belief, almost. Once again, it is this situation worthy, I won't say worthy, I'm speaking in draft here as we kind of set this container in the conversation, of what type of intervention, who I should share that with, that kind of almost helplessness, which also the play then kind of introduces the power that also comes with kind of speaking this out loud. The play also takes place on Independence Day, 4th of July. There's kind of that double meaning that we hit right there. We see fireworks in different moments that help kind of break up or punctuate, I would even say, some of these very serious moments or tones, giving that character Nan a place of rest. Or even with all this cacophony of noise outside, there is a stillness that happens in this cabin that they existed in this space. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting kind of connection back into there as well. I would ask him once again, like, we're trying to take a very informal space into this as well. So if there are any questions that you as the audience have for us or anything like that, please also kind of feel free to kind of bring that up to us. Raise your hand. We'll happily kind of call upon you, bring that up into the space as well. Some of the other, maybe now is a good time, and I'll go ahead and pop over our slide too, when we talk about, we've already brought up resources in some moments, whether that be within the USI campus or for us specifically in the Evansville kind of community as well. What are some of those resources?
Yeah, absolutely. So on campus, our Title IX office would really handle a lot of the, if a student is going through something like this, the employees are responsible employees, so we have to report to Title IX. And I know they always ask, are you safe? That's the only question that we really need to answer. And I think when you intervene in these situations, that is usually the top priority, right? Is this person safe? Do we need to remove them from this situation to make sure that nothing deadly happens to this person? So that's always kind of step one, make sure the person's safe. And then beyond that, once you get referred out, you definitely get access to a lot of the resources on campus. In just the Evansville, kind of Vanderburgh County, there are various shelters. Albion Fellows Bacon Center is one. They're a great shelter. You also have the YWCA in Evansville. I know in Henderson there's not a formal shelter yet, but there is an organization that, the Chloe Randolph organization, and they will go and they will sit with victims in the court. They will, we're actually having a clothing drive and a kind of item drive so that we can build up some resources for them. Henderson didn't have any resources at all. They would just kind of send everybody to Evansville. And so that's why the Chloe Randolph organization was started. There was a Henderson woman who was murdered by her abusive partner, and her family, her mom, started the organization in her memory because, there was nothing there that could help them at that time. So, there's lots of resources available. I think the main thing, again, is making sure people are aware of it and how to access it. There are telephone numbers that you can call. Even if you go to law enforcement and you don't, maybe want to have the person arrested or you don't want to file an official report or things like that, they can still get you access to those resources. They can refer you out. So there's lots of things available. My students have been focusing a lot on e-health resources that are available, and there's a really great app called, I think it's My Plan app, and it's basically an app that will walk you through a safety plan, and it has all of these, really great features built in to help people. They're often always making sure that the person, is their internet usage being monitored, right? They're kind of taking those things into consideration. So there's lots of things out there, and I think the more awareness that you have, then the better people can access them, right? Albion's great. They when they came to my class, a lot of people won't leave because of their pets. Honestly, they don't want to leave their home environment. They might have dogs, reptiles, and Albion takes all of the pets at the shelter. So they're like, we've had snakes in here before, dogs, cats. I think they had like a pony or a horse or something. I mean, they will really take your pets. They'll take everything, right? Because they want to reduce that additional barrier people might face when they're trying to leave these situations. So yeah, I think just having that awareness is important. All of those links are definitely very helpful.
One, I think that once again, this is the kind of the second time that you've mentioned that too. And I know in our first conversation, that awareness, like I had not thought about, like if I thought about children in the intersection of that, but then also once again, it's a spectrum. There are so many, I like that word that you kind of brought up there again, there's these barriers to, Nan talks about her stuff, but we talk about, like you said, the pets, it could be transportation to work. There's so many different intersections of how all of that kind of comes together. And so I think that also shows that there's also not one answer all the time. It is one that, like, I'm not sure if anyone's heard about the bystander intervention, the kind of the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. There's direct, delegate, distract, delay, and document. I would say document's probably one of the newer ones, especially as we moved into a modern age. And it's a combination of, I would say, all of those in different times. Sometimes, once again, that delegate, when it comes to sharing that information with someone, maybe I might not be the person who can specifically help within that, but finding whether those resources, once again, sometimes it might be law enforcement, but it's fine. It's a combination, it seems, of all of those kind of different steps when it comes to the allyship, not to self-title that or anything, but the allyship towards survivors, victims that might be in that situation of domestic violence.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in Executed by a Bear, we see how Nan reacts both with the physical abuse and the mental abuse. So how would you say survivors and victims handle the difference between both the manipulation and mental part of it versus the physical part of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of people aren't aware that emotional intimate partner violence, that psychological, is actually the most common form. If anyone is going to experience intimate partner violence, I think we immediately go to that physical and like the battering incidents, right? And that certainly can happen. But that psychological is by far the most common, and it's usually used in conjunction with another form of intimate partner violence, like physical or sexual violence even. And one of the things that we've been learning this semester in my class is that, with the physical cases, when the person's no longer in that situation, they maybe get some of that peace or they get that break and they don't feel necessarily threatened that entire time. But if it's that psychological, emotional type of intimate partner violence, they're always there. They're always in your mind. They're always there. You hear that voice almost, right? Even if they're not physically there. So it's really difficult when you think about working with these individuals. If someone suffered very intensive psychological abuse and emotional violence, that's a lot of professional, right?
Yeah,
people
sure.
who are trained to kind of break down whatever thoughts you're thinking or have been instilled into you to think. Because it is certainly, some have said, more difficult to recover from that emotional violence and that coercion and that controlling and all of those factors compared to the physical.
When I think, just to kind of pull us back to Exit, once again, Nan, the wife who has her husband Kyle, there's those moments of him in our design conversations with the cast. I kind of always refer to him as trying to cast this spell, almost. And there's moments where he kind of forces them to relive. I talked about those scenes that they kind of replay and reenact. He has them reenact their first few dates. And once again, I think I think it might be easy to see the physical scars and spaces, but that's the mental, mental manipulation, that mental control. And I think something that I know we talked about in our conversation in the lobby a few weeks ago was that, and you even brought up here, that control extends into so many of those other facets. Like you said, some people, there's sometimes partners who monitor every step you take. They might not do anything physical, but the overbearing nature that comes from internet monitoring, phone monitoring, who you're texting, who you're talking to, all of that is a different type of bruise or scar, not to kind of compare once again, the physical and in the mental space. And like you said, I think it takes a lot of time, sometimes even more time for scars like those to heal.
Yeah.
Especially, but once again, I think that's what all being the services that are here at school as well, those trained professionals in psychology, therapy to help once again navigate their own path for those humans themselves to find that peace, that calm that we will hopefully eventually get them to in that time as well.
Yeah, there can be lots of guilt involved. I mean, just so many negative kind of harmful emotions. And one thing I'll add is at our panel, we did have a detective from the Evansville Police Department, and what she noted was that's very disappointing for her is, you know, she'll see the same person, the same victim essentially will come back up in her cases, but they'll be with a different partner. So it's almost like, you know, they go back to that type of relationship even if they've left their like abusive partner that was maybe the first case. So certainly we have lots of discussions about not necessarily what are red flags, because that's very important, right? But also what are green flags? Like what do healthy relationships look like?
Absolutely.
Because for some people they might not have that script.
You
You
don't
know,
have that model.
yeah, they don't have the model, so they don't know what they're supposed to feel in a relationship, right? Maybe they think it's supposed to just be this way because they haven't known anything different. And so making sure that people understand this is healthy, you know, these are things you should be pursuing in a relationship, while also highlighting like, hey, these are some controlling, manipulative behaviors. We want to avoid that, right? Those types of situations.
That what becomes normalized almost.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting point. And I think that might be in there's a lot of references once again in the text that come back to Nan's kind of, I'll say the word obsession, adoration for the President Jimmy Carter. And there's a lot of conversation with this, a specific speech called Crisis in Confidence. That was, I did a little bit of research, don't worry. That was, I believe, specifically in response to an energy crisis in the summer of 1979 that was having the population of America kind of losing faith within the government, within that almost a hopelessness. And I think that that's why Lauren Gunderson puts that in the space, is not so much Nan losing faith in the government, but kind of like that sense of hopelessness almost, or that there's also talks about how her life is not a circle, it's more of a line, and trying to break some of those barriers back down that you had brought up earlier too. And one of the lines that is repeated I think a couple of times within the text is aggression unopposed. Oh gosh, now I have to dig through it. Aggression unopposed becomes a contagious disease. And then Nan does have a line one time in response to that says, and Nan Carter says, "I am not sick no more." And kind of the breaking of that aggression. And you know, once there's a lot of also references to this idea of like this predator-prey kind of situation. Kyle is a hunter. Once again, the play takes place in this northern Georgia cabin. We see these stuffed animal heads around in the space, and once again, I think specifically there's a doe head in the space, and that most times in this kind of environment we would see, you know, hunters are putting the buck on display, the antlers, kind of that form, that like masculine kind of space. And it's specifically that Kyle has put the doe head up there, and Lauren Gunderson puts direct connections to both Nan and this doe, and this kind of finding their own freedom as well. And I think that that's that's interesting, kind of to kind of tack onto what you had brought up there too, that once again, what has been normalized, and kind of that also that when you are in that space of aggression, the response that can come from that as well.
No question?
So, hereditary is not the word I'm necessarily looking for, but would you say domestic violence could be a learned behavior for both a male and like a female or non-binary person for like living with it your entire life and then going on to your own separate like relationships?
Yeah, certainly. Social learning theory is one that's been used often to explain these behaviors, explain how they kind of come about. Now, not every kiddo that sees maybe their parents in this type of situation will go on to also be, you know, to engage in those behaviors, because I think there's sometimes that stereotype, right? Like if your parents were in that abusive situation, then you're automatically going to. That's not really the case, but certainly, they can certainly model those behaviors, learn those behaviors, and I think one of the things that these other agencies do that I haven't touched on yet is they have a lot of education. They do a lot of like prevention efforts. Albion goes into high schools and they talk with teenagers, and they kind of talk about, you know, what's healthy or not healthy in this relationship, right? How you should treat someone. And those things, it's really important, it's really crucial. You know, they said a lot of people who experience these types of relationships will do so starting in their teenage years. You know, it happens at a really young age, really early on. And it's just, if you can get in and kind of intervene or have those conversations at education, then they see different behaviors to model, and then maybe they won't, you know, act out in some of those things. But most certainly there's concerns there, right, with that modeling those types of behaviors.
Well, I think you bring up something really, like, you know, I've said the word intervention a whole lot too,
Mm-hmm.
but prevention is almost, I would say, maybe as or a little bit more important in that way too, because, you know, if we can prevent this, then of course the need for the intervention moves down a little bit more. And so I guess, you know, you've also brought up this kind of the red flag, but also the green flag in the space. Just curious, like, what are some of the things that you and your students are exploring within the green flag, also of these relationships and everything?
Yeah, we really haven't, oh goodness, last Thursday we were talking about it, where I was kind of getting them to think about that, and really it stems back from, we love to talk about risk factors. And so some of like the prevention efforts will target people who are at risk for potentially engaging in those behaviors, which include kiddos who come from, you know, maybe home environments that haven't been very stable, or where we've had, you know, DCS complaints or things like that. And so you have those more like selective ones that target those kiddos that are at risk, but there's also protective factors, right? There's things like, you know, having a good, maybe a good role model outside of your parents, right? Like a coach or a religious person, right? Something of that nature. Like if you, there's those protective factors that maybe are going to make it less likely that you engage in that behavior. And so, you know, if you have really good self-control, just like a whole bunch of things. So that kind of led us to our distinction between like what are the green flags versus like what are the red flags, right? I'm a big Taylor Swift fan, so I would say if you're a Swiftie, that's a green flag for me, right? No, I'm just kidding. Maybe it's, you know, person specific, but, you know, just certainly, you know, you never want to feel bad in that relationship, right? And so when we talk, like if you ever leave and you just don't feel good about yourself, that's not what a romantic relationship should look like,
Sure.
right? So you just want to make sure that, you know, you feel good, honestly. I mean, and I think we know when we don't feel good about ourselves, or if we're uncomfortable in a situation, kind of trusting your gut a little bit. One thing to note is that these relationships, it doesn't go from like 0 to 100 in one day, right? It's gonna be these smaller like behaviors that kind of build up over time. And when you stay in that situation, like the longer you stay, the more you have to justify why you're staying, right? So if you're gonna admit, like at this point that this isn't healthy behavior, then you have to say, I was wrong about all those other behaviors that I stayed through as well. We hate to be wrong. As humans, we do. So it's just, it's really tricky in that regards too. But so I think, you know, those early stages, right? Like the early behaviors where you're like, that's kind of weird, or, you know, I don't feel good, right? I'm not experiencing like this happiness in a relationship, which would be a great green flag, right? So, you know, I think, you know, intervening then is really important, because when it stays and then it starts to escalate and get more intense or severe, that just, again, can make it difficult for people to get out of that situation.
Yeah, that community, because, and I think we're both there, but obviously relationships, once again, spectrums exist in a spectrum,
Right.
and there's, I think it all kind of comes back to that communication of it too. Like you said, the intervention is, you know, hey, when I left last night, things didn't feel good. Let's talk about that now. And I think sometimes the rejection of that conversation from a partner is also just another sign of like, is this, once again, is this a moment where you then have that kind of to take in and be like, could this become a pattern as well?
Yeah.
Could this become a space? Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question?
I know we're talking a lot about, like, we're trying to go towards green flags, but what is, like, for red flags, what are, like, I know controlling and like being in charge and all that of someone's life is like really big, but what are some of the like smaller red flags that are there, like manipulation or like gaslighting?
Yeah, I mean, certainly those elements, you know, if you like have to constantly check in with someone, right? If you're constantly talking to your partner, almost like if you're too dependent on them initially, I think that that is sometimes one where it just maybe seems like they're very much in love, right? And they just always want to talk to each other and always want to be around each other. But healthy relationships can also have that space, and it's not a bad thing, right? And you can go and hang out with your friends for 2 hours and not have to constantly text your partner, not have to constantly answer their phone calls. So it's like little things like that where, you know, if you know, you don't respond right away, they're going to be mad at you. And, you know, maybe they're not going to physically hurt you, right? But you want to avoid them being upset with you. And so those types of behaviors, you know, trying to get someone to do something they don't want to do. Like, I know it sounds silly, but, you know, if someone's tired and they want to go to bed and their partner's like, no, I want you to stay up, right? Like, just those little things, controlling what they eat, what they wear, absolutely, right? Like, I don't like it when you wear those types of clothes, you know, or things like that. So those, like, kind of smaller instances where, you know, as a person, you maybe don't want to be like, am I blowing this out of proportion? Is this weird? Maybe, and then you like almost, right, gaslight yourself almost to the extent where you're, you know, trying to maybe ignore some of those earlier warning signs. But any belittling, you know, like I said, just if you're in a situation and you don't feel good, you know, you leave a date or you know, leave your partner's house and you're like, I feel really bad about myself. Like, you should never feel that way in a romantic relationship with a partner. So, yeah, there's lots of other ones. The resources have all sorts of things that you can kind of pick up on and see. I know one of the things that people talk about is like if you're wearing clothes, if it's the summer and people are in hoodies and sweatshirts and jackets kind of covering their arms and stuff, wearing long pants when it's like 95 degrees outside, that's sometimes hey, that's kind of odd, why are you behaving that way? This is kind of more noticing signs with your friends, right? Maybe you're not experiencing it, but you think your friend's going through something like this. Any like sharp behavior changes, if they start to become more and more isolated, things like that.
I think one of the things that I was, once again, kind of like looking for resources for this conversation and everything, I did see one that was a very simple line of, trust your gut. If it feels weird, it's probably weird.
Yeah.
You know, that was a very simple way to kind of put the complexity, once again, of the spectrum that we're talking about. But I think that's also part of it. Like kind of what you're saying too. Like if you notice, if you're able to clock that when you're leaving or when that moment happens, it is important. And you know, trusting your gut, whether that is talking with that that partner in that moment, whether it's going to a friend and being like, hey, let me put this into space as well. And I think that's, I know in no way am I saying that that's an easy thing once again to do, but I think, and that's also what I think the play talks about well, is like putting it, making people say some of those things out loud is just another way of recognition, confrontation maybe, or of kind of those spaces, those moments as well.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're talking about this in relationship to this particular play. How would you say that popular culture or films or television have affected the way people see domestic violence, either in a positive way or a negative way?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Media certainly influences our perceptions. It influences what we think when things come to mind. Yeah, it's difficult to say. I think when we think about, you know, intimate partner violence or domestic violence, we right away go to those physical battering situations. And as I mentioned, really that emotional, psychological is what's more common. And so I think because when you see it portrayed in film or media, it's often that like very extreme, physical, lots of danger involved, right? So that can sometimes cloud our understanding of what this actually looks like and what most cases look like. That's like, you know, whenever I say arrest maybe is not the best option, in some cases it is. You know, if someone is very violent and they are potentially going to kill someone, yeah, we would want to remove them from that situation. And so if that's what comes to mind and I try to advocate for a non-criminal, you know, oriented intervention, then I maybe seem like I'm kind of, you know, crazy, or I'm just like, why would she say that? And so I think that the media can play a role in that regard, influencing what we think about the situation, how we think about victims. Unfortunately, there can be media that encourages some of those violent acts, or like it portrays those toxic relationships as like something you should strive for. So it can be tricky, especially for younger folks, younger kiddos who are very impressionable by media, by artists, and things like that. So, there's lots of ways that it could. I think, what comes to my mind the quickest is just what we think about domestic violence and what we think it looks like. That's largely going to come from either our own experiences or the media.
So before the show, like the pre-show thing, Kyle is watching all of this media, and one I recognized like immediately was like Andrew Tate, and a lot of younger males and like men my age, they're like starting to like pick up on his behavior, saying like, wow, this is the alpha male, like this guy is great. How do we like steer people not to go that way? Like there's still a lot of like men coming out in the media, like having all these opinions about women, what they should do, what they shouldn't do. Like how do we advocate for that? Because I find it like really complicated. Like I'm like, this is really bad, guys, and I'm like, why? Blah, 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 blah. Like how? I
wish I knew just like right away, super easy thing, right? First Amendment, so we can't be like, just remove their platform. So, but that's such a good question. And when you asked it, what was coming to my mind was that when we talk about domestic violence, and a lot of the work that a lot of early campaigns in the 60s and the 70s that were advocating for police and for society to take these crimes seriously, because before it was a private matter, it was in the home and we're not going to intervene because that's not our place. So we had to work really hard to shift that narrative to say, no, this is a serious issue. No, we need to intervene as best as we can, right? And we're learning about what that best intervention is, because it's not the same for everybody. But a lot of what they talk about as far as that domestic violence is that it's really inherent. It's a unique form of violence that's inherent in the patriarchy. And so living in this patriarchal society, men want to maintain their power, and a way of doing that is to engage in these types of behaviors with their romantic partners, right? Now, of course, that doesn't work as the best explanation for like same-sex couples, right? Or if women initiate violence, because they can. It's not necessarily as common that we see, right? But they can. And so, it's in the hopes that I would have is that as men and women become more equal in society, politically, socially, all of those things, that we see those narratives just start to quiet down a little bit. But it's probably not a coincidence that they're coming back at a certain time, right? When maybe their power is a little threatened as being like a white cis male, right? And so they're concerned about not having that grip anymore. So, it's difficult. You have these conversations about privilege and things like that, and that certainly doesn't mean that your life hasn't been difficult, but it's really just trying to increase empathy for people and their situations. So hopefully maybe some of these targeted programs, right, can kind of let them know, like, there's healthy ways to show your masculinity, and being masculine's not bad, right? Like, that's not inherently a bad thing, but if you're, mean to your partner, if you're rude to show you're masculine, that's where the concern comes from. But I think changing that narrative and having healthy role models for males that portray their masculine in a way that doesn't hurt anybody else is what we can maybe try to focus on and raise those voices, right? Maybe try to quiet out the other ones. But
there's I think that kind of, like you talked, the education, the mentorship in that. There's also a line in the play because about there's a difference between being a father and being a baby daddy, and I know that's specifically the text within the play, but there's a hard truth to that as well. And I think that as we talk about masculinity, that's a very, I am a cis white male, and like I was lucky to have coaches and people who taught me in a very different way, just to speak from my eye. But of course, there is obviously this kind of barrage right now of this alpha male. I was in another session earlier this year, and they said when you're used to 100%, 99% feels like an injustice. And that's, I mean, I think I very much am in agreement with you. I want to see this continuation of a tear down of this patriarchal space that we exist in. And I think that there's a lot of people struggling with where they fit in some of this, and not that I think, obviously, the answer to that is not to take it out in these other humans or reject kind of a humanity in that space. But I think that is the big thing, is trying to hold up these role models, and these role models do exist.
Yeah.
They exist in a lot of spaces. I think it's us trying to find the balance, and I think that's the thing, is we're still constantly working in this space of elevating those voices just as much as the controversial voices of a Tate, of an Aiden Ross, or something like that as well.
Which also, you know, they say those outrageous things because people will watch it and they get, you know what I mean? It's a very nuanced situation for sure. One other thing I hadn't mentioned yet was another theory that's used to explain violence against women is this male peer support theory. And it's basically this idea that males have been socialized within their peer groups that, you know, if your, you know, woman does something, you have to put her in her place. And like there's support from your peer group with that, right? So if we dismantle that support, right? If you go to your male peer friends and say you participate in this behavior and they shame you for it, right? It's not going to be as likely to continue. But if they support it, or they're like, yeah, you know, you got to do whatever. I mean, I don't have a lot of male peer groups that I'm a part of, you know. But yeah, I think, you know, just having more of those like social, cultural changes in our perceptions of people, building that empathy, learning how to process our emotions and properly regulate them. You know, one thing I always tell my male students is I'm like, the patriarchy's not really good for you either. It puts both people, you know, everybody in a box, saying this is what you have to do and this is what you can't do. You know, we've heard it before, boys don't cry. Okay, well now we have a bunch of older males who can't process their emotions, and when they have those extreme emotions, then they, you know, react usually violently or negatively. And so I think that that's really important and healthy too. And I do think that it is changing. You know, I do think that we're seeing shifts and stuff, most certainly compared to where we were, like in the 60s and the 70s and everything. So I do think it's getting better. But that was another theory I hadn't been able to mention yet.
Great minds think alike. I have a question exactly like yours. So we also see at the beginning with that TV, he's watching like some Fox News and Fortnite and Andrew Tate, and most of the things that relate with like Fox News, because I can't stand watching it myself, but like it's always has this religious undertone with its toxic masculinity and patriarchy. Would you say that like religion is a huge part in like how these guys react with like them thinking that they're above everyone else just because this religious book says so?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Really one that in my class we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, that religious component. There's been some cultural conversations that we've had. Yeah, I mean, I think it's each person is so unique, right? And our experiences are so unique. It just really depends, I think, what type of environment, what setting you're in, what is the, you know, the message that religious person, your pastor, your priest, or whoever your religious leader is, right? Kind of what message are they sharing with you? Because a lot of, you know, my personal faith is very much, you know, love thy neighbor, and you know, so it would directly go against that type of behavior that they're exhibiting, right? If they're engaged in that violent, aggressive behavior. So I don't know. It's a good question. It's certainly one to consider.
And I think like Dr. Petty brought up, it's hard to make the generalization that for everyone it's the bad thing, because I think for some humans that might be the grounding principle that helps love thy neighbor and helps bring that humanity. I think the extremisms, for me personally, speaking from my eye, that's where I think we see difficulties once again with that navigation, whether it be of emotion or reaction, especially some of the rigidity that we can see in all religions and culture spaces, beliefs, whatever that might be. It's that those extremisms and kind of just a staunch belief of what I have is so precious and I must protect it in a way that I think that's where we do see a lot of those issues specifically there. And I think, I mean, we are about to go into an election year next year. I can only imagine we are going to see a spectrum of advocacy, sadly, from both sides of that.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that we are, like we talked about, we're on a path, we're trying to find this space of acceptance of humanity, not only of acceptance, but of fostering of all humans and whatever that intersection of life may be. But not everyone is on the same path, and not everyone moves at the same speed. So that's why it's so hard. Once again, I don't want to generalize, because it's not my right to do. It's not what I should do, but it's also such a complex space within that as well. But I do have a hope, and I think, I'll be honest, as I look at my classroom, as I look at my students, holy cow, the awareness, the consciousness that you all have compared to what I had, even just as a younger professor, what I went through with my colleagues, with my peers, it is to not sound fake, but like, it's inspiring. Does it make it more difficult teaching in moments? Of course, but that's because it's a different type of challenge. It's a different type of interrogation of pedagogy, of identity, of consciousness, of just what we're also bringing into the space and into the classroom, that I think, at least from the outside looking in, not that I'm saying it's y'all's generation to make this better and everything. It's absolutely the full gamut of all of us as humans. But I have so much more hope because of the consciousness that, like, from the questions that we've even heard today, that shows me that this is something that, like, I didn't talk about this in college, really, in many classes, or even have seminars or like little hearing, like conversations, dialogues like this. So that makes me much more hopeful for the steps and the what am I trying to say? The concrete that these steps will also stick. They're not just fads. I'm once again speaking in draft, trying to find the language in the moment. But I do believe that we are able to have that greater consciousness that, like, these are things that are toxic. These are things that can infect whether that mind, that can move us into that mentality. And we are getting more and more resources to now educate and intervene, to prevent, and all of those steps as well.
Yeah, because I think it is, bringing up some of, like, the news sources and stuff. It's important to be a good critical thinker so that you can evaluate the sources, and you can go find information to learn more about a topic and be informed as a voter and all of those things. And I think you're seeing pushes for that. And with technology, we have access to those resources. We have the ability to look up something right away and try to find maybe more factual information, or just get information from multiple sources, because certainly people have narratives, right? They have an agenda that's I think accepted, and so trying to broaden the information that you get, I think is always a good idea.
Who's writing the news?
Yes.
Whose news is not being published? All of those intersections of that kind of
absolutely
pulling in of information.
Yeah. And that, you mentioned kind of like the God complex, I think, right, where, like, they feel like above it, that's also just like a narcissistic personality disorder, you know what I mean? So, excuse me, probably, some need for trained professional help in those settings as well. If you don't feel remorse for what you're doing, or you don't think what you're doing is wrong, or you have a right to do it, that's a deeper issue that, again, professionals would need to try to address and intervene with. Yeah.
We'll go here
Which
first.
one? Yeah, Sherry.
Okay. Since like the Me Too movement, have you guys noticed any more stories that have come out since then, that, like, there's actually an uptick in people speaking out about these issues? And I feel like it was kind of like a mixed bag when all of that came out. Like, who are you going to believe? And it's just complicated.
Yeah.
So.
It is very complicated. You know, the Me Too movement definitely increased awareness, which is great. We actually read an article in my class that was looking at like your prototypical features of harassment, which is usually a male actor, a female target. You know, it was a physical or sexual behavior, and all these things. And so that, again, shapes our perspective, what we think that harassment is. And if you have a scenario that doesn't fit those prototypical features, maybe you don't view it as harassment as often, which can be concerning. So it definitely increased awareness, but also it makes us maybe fixate on one type of situation that's harassment when it's so complex and just lots of different things could be considered harassing. Oh gosh, I'm trying to think about the second part of more people coming forward. I mean, you know, going back to the media, I mean, like the Johnny Depp and the Amber Heard case, I think was really, and I haven't watched the Netflix documentary, but, you know, a lot of people that were speaking about that were, you know, how she was treated in the media, what that's going to do moving forward, right? Because she was really not treated well at all, yeah, is that going to prevent people from wanting to come forward and speak out? So we've had some very public movements like the Me Too movement where it's maybe encouraged people to speak out, but then we have other instances where we've been horrible to individuals. And, you know, I think the most important thing is to let people confide in you, or they report it or something. You know, we have to take it seriously. So you have to believe them to a certain extent, right? You have to believe them enough to want to start an investigation, to want to try and get them help. And that was what we struggled with for so long. So we have all these campaigns, believe women, right? Absolutely, believe victims, really. But yeah, it's tricky. I don't really know, you know, moving forward. With the pandemic, people working at home, you saw some upticks. Some studies report some upticks with, like, especially the psychological and emotional ones. Yeah, I mean, my hopes is that people have access to the resources. They know that they're there. They can then use them and get help. But one thing to note is most people, if they're going to try to get any resources, it's informal, right? They're going to, like, talk to their friend. They're going to talk to a parent maybe, or a guardian or a sibling, a peer, basically a coworker, anybody. They're not going to go straight to, like, the police usually, unless it's that, like, very lethal situation. So, yeah, being able to direct people where they need to go, knowing that they're probably going to use that informal method more often than not, I think is important. So, yeah, I don't, that's a great question. Wish I had a better answer.
So, in this play, it's about Nan being abused by Kyle. But how do you think it would have been if the roles were reversed and it was Kyle being abused by Nan? And then adding to the fact that Nan's also pregnant with Kyle's child, and adding that onto the roles being reversed.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's kind of, I don't say controversy, but there's kind of a little bit of a controversy in the field because there's these, like, gender asymmetry is the issue. And so is it that men commit these acts more, and, you know, therefore our intervention and our prevention strategy should be targeted for them, or is it that women are just as likely as men to be violent, but maybe men don't report it as often? And it's difficult to say, and we get a lot of mixed data because we're using different sources to collect it. So if you ask people, you do a survey, in the past 30 days, have you hit, kicked, pushed your partner, anything like that? The surveys don't allow for that context. When women are in these, what tends to happen is if women are engaged in violent behaviors, it's usually in self-defense almost, or that the situation itself kind of, like, both partners were contributing to the violence. So it's certainly tricky. Of course, women can be abusive and they can engage in these behaviors. But I don't know, you know, how it would be received. It's definitely still interesting.
Well, I think, like you brought up, I'll take a moment. Like we've like, and you even noted it earlier. We've definitely been talking about relationships that are, you know, we're talking about between a man and a woman. We have there is a whole spectrum of sexuality and gender expression that, you know, I at least from a lot of the research that I was looking at earlier today, you know, trans women, especially trans women of color, are some of the leading victim survivors that come from this world of domestic violence. And once again, there's no one recipe, because I think just like to that question, if it was Kylina and man, you know, or if it were two male presenting humans within that space, I think it all kind of goes back to what you said, that belief that whomever is bringing or presenting that information, there's truth in that.
Yeah.
And it's still that, like, then it becomes taking that truth and what is the process for that human, that community of people, because resources once again exist in a spectrum as well, and no one reaction will be the same for every single person in this situation, except I think, at least once again to speak from my eye, is that initial belief.
Yeah. And the forms of violence do look different. So when women engage in more of the abusive, violent behaviors, like they tend to throw things, they tend to like slap, right? Whereas when men engage in these behaviors, it's you know, more like a punch or a kick or a push or a shove and things like that. So sometimes the behaviors look different depending on that relationship. And another thing to know, one of the articles we read that I really enjoyed this semester was looking at you know, genderqueer populations, and they faced other types of like emotional intimate-partner violence, like being threatened to be outed and refusing to use proper pronouns or things like that. So depending on your population, like the behaviors can look different or be different, and it's important to be considered, you know, consider that as well and recognize it as an abusive behavior, even if it's wouldn't be considered for other populations.
I think the once again, that belief in the listening, I think once again that the reaction or the rejection to act how you would urgently is a little bit too, you know, like, because I think that's, like you said, there's so many different multifaceted elements to identity. And then when we interject something like domestic partner violence into those intersections, it becomes, once again, something that is just as precious as the information that was kind of shared with us as well.
Absolutely. And it kind of touches back on something we talked about at the very beginning of our conversation today about how there are communities that don't feel comfortable contacting the police because of, you know, past relations. And so it's the whole class I have taught this semester is really focused on that intersectional component, which is just basically saying, yeah, there's multiple identities within one person. You know, your race, your ethnicity, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, your religion, all of these things, right? And so it's important to take into account all of those factors, certainly.
We got time for like one more.
Okay. Say you have a friend that you can see their partner is engaging in domestic violence, like emotional, talking to them in a certain way. They've been together for a long time, and she doesn't see it, but you do, because you're on the outside looking in. It's a little bit easier to see, I feel. How do you even handle that situation when they don't even know that they're in that situation?
Yeah, it's very delicate, right? Because I think, you know, I know if my friend came up to me and said that their partner was doing these things, and even if they didn't see it, you know, your initial reaction is like, they're a jerk, right? Like, you shouldn't be with this person. Like, you want to be like kind of negative, but stemming from like your protective feelings over that person that you care about. And so one of the most important things is to not do that. It feels odd, but like to not badmouth their partner, because if they're confiding in you, saying like, hey, this happened, or you notice something, you see it, if you badmouth their partner or things like that, then they're not going to want to confide in you moving forward. So it's just important to really try to be supportive, and I think, try to organically or naturally slide in some of those resources, right? Or be like, hey, have you seen this, or did you see that this is a thing now? Or, I saw this on Twitter the other day or Facebook or something, and it was focusing on this aspect of relationships, and, trying to gently guide them there, I think is what's important. As I said, if you don't have that script for what a healthy relationship looks like, you maybe don't realize that you're in a situation that isn't healthy. And so I think, being supportive, being gentle, and trying to increase their knowledge and information the best that you can is what, best thing you could do probably in that situation.
And would you say, I think, focus on them,
Yes,
as opposed to
yeah.
that partner,
Yeah.
once again, whether it be negative or why are you
Right.
still there, why are you with them? It's
Right.
focusing on them and the safety, and I think
Mhm.
the providing simply of space.
Mhm.
I think that, like what you had brought, like sometimes, I know I have friends where I could be very direct and be like, hey, I've noticed you're wearing long sleeves in the
Mhm.
summer. Is
Yeah.
it's 95 degrees outside.
Mhm.
Is everything okay?
Yeah.
But then I also have friends where it's more about just cracking that door open, I'll
Yeah.
say, and being like, I was on Instagram and I saw this
Mm-hmm.
infographic and I was like, man, I just had a moment of consciousness with that, and then it just provides the space that becomes part of
Mhm.
your vocabulary or just even that conversation.
Yes,
That
yeah.
allows for them to then also
Mhm.
once again present you
Yeah,
with that
so-
information as well.
Yeah, feel comfortable with you and confiding in you. And it's so much easier said than done, because the other day my friend was talking to me, my best friend, and she was talking with this person, and she was like, yeah, they were saying these things, and I was like, that's not normal, that's not okay, you shouldn't talk to them anymore. And I did not do what I just said you should do. I was not very supportive. I was very much like, yeah, you should cut that out. But also, they weren't really technically dating yet, right? They were just talking. So the context is super important, that situation. But, the longer they've been with someone, it's going to be harder for them to maybe recognize and address the fact, because again, if you're going to admit that what's going on right now isn't okay, then you have to admit what happened leading up to that also wasn't okay. And that just does not make us feel good. So,
Yeah, just the support of, also just now taking that away from here too is like, you now know that if you happen to have to approach a
Mhm.
friend or in that space, it's like, I also know that there are so many complexities with this,
Mhm.
that I am here to help you navigate through, and however you want me to do that.
Mhm, yeah.
Whether a very active person who's with you, maybe sitting with you in a space, or someone who just simply opens up that door and just listens,
mhm, yes, absolutely.
Were there any other kind of questions or anything? Awesome. I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Petty, for being here and being part of this conversation. Thank you for you all coming and being part of our audience and everything. And once again, I'll leave the slide up for a little bit longer. If you or anyone you know would benefit from any of these resources, this education, this space, all of these different QR codes will take you to different websites. We also have some of these similar QR codes that are displayed during our production of Exit Pursued by a Bear as well. And if you ever need anything, especially if you're in the USI campus, I'm sure Dr. Petty and I are more than willing to, once again, help navigate and direct you to wherever you might need.
Mhm. There's some of these links, I should also say, have places to volunteer, places to donate. So if you're passionate about this topic, a lot of those service providers run on donations. They run on grants. So they would, I'm sure, certainly appreciate any help you could provide. So.
Thank you all.